if we could go on for another couple of hours, and I'm sure, but we can't. So we're going to come back to the ostensible subject of this final session of FSI, and that's to talk a little bit about the future of this field in which you are interested because of your presence here, and in which you will be stakeholders after tonight. Maciej and then Mary gave you examples, as there have been examples all week, of knowledge that has been crystallized from experience, from scholarship, from research, and from the cooperation, historically, of leaders and participants, further providing testimony and eyewitness accounts of the use of civil resistance and its effects. There is a vast cloud of witnesses, historically as well as today, to this phenomenon. And it falls to some organizations, including ours, we believe, to try to harvest this knowledge, to try to understand it better, to try to expand it and fill in the gaps. One of the gaps, as I suggested before, relatively speaking, is that about transitions, or the continuation of the struggle after the struggle is supposed to have won. There are two others that I want to mention because I think they are among the most important, understudied, and yet decisive dimensions of the use of civil resistance. One is the economics of civil resistance. I say, other observers of nonviolent conflict are constantly saying, if they have a strategic perspective, that one of the ways in which movements and campaigns succeed is by taking action that imposes more costs upon their opponent than they have to absorb in order to take that action. And to do that, you have to have a strategic sense of the risks you're going to take and the costs you're going to absorb and the costs that you can transfer to your opponent. That's related, as an example, to the phenomenon of stimulating defections and defections from and divisions within military and security services if your opponent is an authoritarian regime. Because the greater the cost that an authoritarian regime pays for maintaining control, the more people inside the regime who are in charge of enforcing it begin to question whether it can be sustained. But to even get to the point of putting such a regime on the ropes, way back when the movement begins, you have to begin planning and weighing strategically what these costs might be. You have to imagine what they can be. As you think tactically about making decisions, you have to look at every tactic and every action and weigh those costs and benefits. So we're using terminology which comes out of economics. It makes sense, therefore, does it not, to bring what we know of economics to an assessment of civil resistance campaigns and movements, but it's never been done. This is largely work that has yet to be done from a scholarly perspective. John Gould, one of our academic advisors who teaches at Colorado College, is himself an economist, and I've been sort of giving him hints, John, this is really important, you're our only economist, you really should start studying this. Instead, academics are always unruly, he has decided, instead of studying that, he will study the other major understudied dimension of civil resistance, in my judgment, which is the psychology of how movements and campaigns are summoned. And he's coming out with a book on this. So all these years I've been talking about economics. He's really been talking about another subject, which is of more interest to me personally and to others, including some in this room, but which is equally important in trying to understand how you produce success. There are some trainers in nonviolent action who emphasize civil resistance as a technique. You even heard Gene Sharp the other day use the term technique. And when people who don't understand the subject listen to that terminology, they think that you're describing some kind of formula, some kind of magic formula, some kind of series of techniques that create the equivalent of a nonviolent coup. And maybe you could do that if you had enough resources and if you had a sufficiently brilliant strategy. Maybe that even has been done, but that's not the same thing as what Gandhi did or what other leaders of movements did, which took longer, not just because they didn't have the internet, but because they faced certain obstacles and impediments that they needed to organize deeply and make good decisions over a long period of time in order to make progress in finally reaching success. And one of those dimensions is learning how, in the case of Gandhi, through trial and error and through his own personal study of this form of political action, learning how not just to make good strategic decisions, but what language to use and how to communicate interactively with people who he expected to join the movement in order to summon a movement, in order to not simply inspire them with some sort of speech that made them feel good. This isn't feel-good politics like you have in the advanced industrial democracies. This is actually reaching people on an existential level and bringing them up out of their acquiescence to recognize, easier to do, yes, after something like a Khalid Said tragedy in Egypt as an example, but bringing them up out of their acquiescence to recognizing that they are the society. It's not going to go anywhere unless they get into the driver's seat. So the psychology, this is reducible in academic terms to the psychology of recruitment and mobilization. As I just suggested, it's a lot bigger than that. And that's an interest of Nicole Argo, who comes at this subject from in some respects from the same direction that Erica Chenoweth did, which is first studying violent insurgents. So then the subject becomes insurgency, and then there are similar mechanisms because you are looking at the organism of a movement, a campaign, or at least a group that is trying to undertake insurrectionary action. Interesting that Kurt Schock, who you met earlier this week, called his book Nonviolent Insurrections because he wanted to get at both at the idea that this was, convulsive event, but also it was powered by ordinary people expressing, grievances, and it was based on popular action. There are other subjects in the field of civil resistance which need more investigation and more study. I predict there will be additional understandings about this phenomenon that we don't even yet recognize will need to be studied in the years ahead because they haven't emerged yet to our view. And I'm absolutely certain that there are people in this room who are beginning this week, perhaps even before this week, to have inklings of what some of those aspects or dimensions of civil resistance or nonviolent action might be that require study. You don't need to be an academic to do this study. Journalists do it all the time when they do investigative journalism. You don't need to be even any longer a terrific writer. You can be a video journalist like Greg Berger. You can be in the news business if your fact-finding and if your analysis is robust enough to bring forward a statement of the knowledge you have discovered and contribute to this field. We want to incentivize that. We want to stimulate that. And so we would really encourage everybody here to be in touch with us about those subjects and issues and topics of interest to you, because we may decide as you bring us an idea or give us a proposal, that's really interesting. And now that we know you, and now that we know we have taken you through our car wash of FSI, and you've gotten all wet with the knowledge of civil resistance, that we can send you out and you can bring knowledge back. We're hunters and gatherers of knowledge in a certain sense. Any questions or thoughts or ideas or contributions to this phase of this last session? Do you have additional ideas and other things that...
Sure.
Go ahead.
Sure. A couple things is that despite all the exciting things that have happened, these unarmed insurrections and the overthrow of dictatorships, The actual empirical research is somewhat spotty. I mean, obviously, Gandhi's campaign in India has been well researched. The People Power movement in the Philippines in 1986, which many people see as sort of the launch of this new this phase of nonviolent struggle, has been well researched, as have the revolutions in Eastern Europe, 1989 through Serbia and Ukraine more recently. But there have been a lot of areas, particularly the global south, that have been neglected. Bangladesh is like the 7th largest country in the world in population, and their uprising against Rashad in 1991. I've seen virtually nothing written on that. A more recent revolution in Nepal, where Maoist guerrillas laid down their arms and made alliance with pro-democracy forces and bringing down a 300-year-old dynasty. But particularly Africa. And there have been Mali, Madagascar, Benin. These are particularly interesting, I believe. Pardon?
Zambia?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of cases in sub-Saharan Africa that do not meet any of the criteria traditionally of the that some pundits say has to happen for a successful nonviolent revolution to take place, such as not just Facebook and modern technologies, but media and democratic tradition and other high literacy rates and all these kinds of things that are supposedly prerequisites. So. Research on this would be important, and again, in certain cases, ICNC could indeed help support that. Another area is an issue of nonviolent resistance to coups. Now, Gene Sharp has done some work on that, going back from the cop push in Germany in 1923 through the to the coup attempt against Gorbachev in Russia in 1991. But there have been a number of other case studies that haven't gotten that much attention. 1986 in Argentina, where nearly 1 million people came out in the street saying, "No, we are not going back." When there was an there was a coup attempt against their first democratic government in some time. Case of Venezuela in 2002. There were a number of others as well that deserve attention. Also, I think there's a growing interest in the power of nonviolent action against what some people, would argue is a new form of tyranny, or at least undemocratic forces, and that's the increasing concentration of power in powerful corporations, and the impact that has on national sovereignty and indigenous rights, and particularly the environment. And just as we hear a lot about globalization from above, there's also globalization from below. And the many efforts of resistance, we've heard made a couple of references to this, but this is really where I think we're going to see a lot more happening in the coming years, and I think a lot more research is needed. And finally, I just want to take one tangent that's kind of important. And that is because of the power of strategic nonviolent action, there are obviously some very powerful forces that trying to stop it. I posted earlier this afternoon an interesting piece based on a leaked document from the Syrian government about how they are, their strategy against discrediting the movement, even shooting some of their own troops and making it look like it comes from the crowd. I mean, just pretty amazing things like that. And one of the things, of course, is the tendency for governments to try to see any kind of resistance against them as something coming from the outside, from outside agitators or whatever. And I addressed this some the other day. But among some of the attacks actually have come to claim that Gene Sharp and the Albert Einstein Institution, Canvas, and even ICNC have are somehow part of some conspiracy with the U.S. government or whatever. And it's pretty bizarre stuff. But because the United States really has engaged in attempts at regime change and some pretty nefarious activity, particularly under the Bush administration, it's easy for some people to there's so many real conspiracies out there. Some people actually start believing some of the false ones, and As you know, ICNC is an educational foundation that does not take political positions. I mean, ironically, most of us the vast majority of us individually have politics well to the left of center, but as an organization, we're just out to disseminate this kind of information. And well, ICNC doesn't have a whole lot of money. It has more than any other group that has systematically. Tried to educate people on this phenomenon, and so I guess I'm speaking because I'm not on the formal payroll of ICNC and on the staff. I am a full-time professor, and I work as I chair the academic advisory committee. But if any of you hear anything that you're concerned about, or any kind of or rumors or anything like that, please email me. I'll keep the communication private. And in case there, I do need to clear things up on that, because unfortunately it has had some impact. There's some rumors at this very gathering a couple of years ago that were kind of upsetting, and there are a number of people we would have loved to have had here but did not come because they heard something on the internet that we had some ties to U.S. government or whatever, and didn't come. These are people who are wonderful, incredible activists and doing really good work. They could have found our information very useful, but they're unable to take advantage of it because, unfortunately, they fell victim to this kind of disinformation. So I just wanted to put that out directly in case there are any kind of concerns along those lines.
Questions? Comments at this point?
Just one little thing. I just received an email from Steven Zunis while he was talking, so I was like, wow.
That's what he can do for you.
Bravo.
I have a question about the research side of things, because I'm new to this topic of the research side of it. How much research has been done as the opposite of this, like a critical academic research on why this doesn't work, or how historically it hasn't worked? For example, if the 50 out of 67, the trail of it proves that it doesn't work. Has there actually been research that shows that?
I wouldn't say that there has been. There's misinformation and disinformation, but that's based on usually just opinion and ideology. It's not really based on academic research. There are plenty of differences of opinion and disputes theoretically within the scholarship about nonviolent action. Undoubtedly, the most famous one is the objection of Robert Burroughs, the scholar, to Gene Sharp's relatively expansive application of the consent theory of power, which is that political power is produced by the support given by the people to a ruler, or in turn can be taken away from a ruler with the withdrawal of that consent. That's a very robust debate, and most of us who've thought about or written about the consent providing or withdrawing function within the use of civil resistance have views on both sides of that, and like any other scholarly debate, that can get pretty heated. But even to the level of personal denunciations. But that's normal. But I'm not. Is anybody else aware of any? Go ahead.
The fact that there is not much actually critical literature of civil resistance in the first place is because civil resistance is not oftentimes on the map to start with. So oftentimes, for civil resistance to be on the map, you have to acknowledge importance and role and impact of agency. And oftentimes, actually, the focus is on the structure and on the political elites, on the macro.
What do you mean by agency, Maciej? Explain.
Well, in the field of civil resistance, there will be ordinary people that undertake collective action, and through that collective action, change power dynamics. And oftentimes that's not acknowledged. So if it's not acknowledged, it's difficult to see the critical kind of evaluation of this, which would be very much welcome, because that would only kind of enrich, I think, the discussion about what works in terms of skills, in terms of methods of resistance, and what doesn't.
Jim, can I go back to this presentation? I'm a bit sort of like maybe unclear, like confused when you mention about these components or situations that are sort of like contributing during the transition process or determining the successful transition or coming out of oppression to the maybe liberation, so to speak. I'm just trying to understand those cases that you mentioned, those components or conditions that you mentioned. I can think of a few, areas or a few situations or maybe even a few conditions that these components don't exist. Maybe sometimes some of the components don't, sometimes none of the components that exist, right? So I'm just trying to understand how could these components or functionalities or conditions could become like playing significant roles in determining whether the success of the transition. So like like chicken and egg, so like the dilemma that just kind of going through in my head. So if these are the components or these are the functionalities or conditions will be determining in terms of whether transition will be successful or not, and then I can think of, or maybe I'm sure all these different conditions do not have these sort of conditions. So am I sort of
Right, I think that surprisingly enough, you can find a number of attributes and properties that make civil resistance being successful in the first place, playing a very important role in successful transition. So if we look at the properties of civil resistance, one could perhaps claim, and that was actually what the term comes from Jackson Peter's book, that civil resistance is a sort of incubator of democracy. Because it's essentially an island within which democracy is practiced, within which we are making democracy happen. And at the same time, while we are making democracy happen inside the movement, this is the way we resist. This is the way also we build the movement. So, for example, coalition building within the movement is as important during the resistance as it is during the transition. And oftentimes, the method you build the movement, the method you build coalitions in terms of deliberative processes, in terms of listening to people, in terms of convincing and negotiating with the people to join the movement, you use the same actual skills to navigate through the transition as a political actor. So in that sense, I think, and that's why we see such a strong correlation between successful civil resistance, which is based on the very kind of principles that are important for democracy, and then successful democratic transition. And the question is how those principles of civil resistance perhaps stay in place and are active during the transition. And I would say that if you look at the literature on social capital, you can perhaps make a claim that during the civil resistance, whether that civil resistance is underground, whether it's legal, semi-legal, or illegal, it builds so-called social capital through different relationships, through different interactions, through different experience, the social capital that then is important during the transition. In that case, I could perhaps argue that the longer civil resistance, the greater probability of emergence of that social capital, and the greater probability of successful transition, which I would not wish to anyone to have long civil resistance. But during the civil resistance phase, people are learning democracy, even if they are living under oppression and under undemocratic system that then eventually will play perhaps intangible, very elusive, but still very important role during the transition.
Ivan? I would just add that I think this is a crucial point. I would even, this is not empirically proved, but from my experience, intuitively know that the longer and more difficult the struggle, the stronger the civil society and more resilient the democracy later. And in our case, I mean, we kind of went through like really kind of tough, for Europe, let's say for European standards, because we live in Europe, very tough dictatorship. There are, of course, much tougher dictatorships elsewhere. But after Milosevic was brought down, we had a very fragile democracy, and only strengthened itself in the last maybe few years. There was a coup d'etat attempted. There was assassination of our prime minister. There was a secession of Kosovo, which produced like riots and all that stuff. But I think the reason why we managed to survive, because the resistance movement, although it dissolved as a resistance movement after the transition, those informal contacts of people and informal networks were still there, and they were the civil society, and got really quickly mobilized when it was necessary to defend the victory that we achieved against Milosevic. So whenever that was threatened, we mobilized in a matter of hours, not days, not weeks, because it was, and we had the necessary skills that Maciej was explaining that we developed over the course of years that were necessary in that. So even in these, how shall I say, critical moments, you know, it proved that the experience that we had and skills and everything and contacts that we established with each other were crucial in defending them.
Go ahead, sure.
Dalia, do you feel that in Sudan, the Sudanese experience with important nonviolent struggles of the past is well understood and perceived?
It's understood, but it's looked down upon because we've had two, 1964 and 1984, 85, I don't remember the exact date. But the two of them were successfully overthrew the governments, and there was a temporary democracy, but because it was so weak in keeping the democracy, and we ended up with dictators that were worse than the ones before, people are definitely not supportive of nonviolent resistance because they see it as a weak alternative to a situation that we can't handle.
Before we take any more questions, let me cover a little bit more ground with Darren Cambridge as well as with Nicola, if she'd like to add to this discussion, about the second thing we wanted to talk about here. Then we'll take other interventions and any other concluding thoughts that people want to offer. The session was supposed to end 4 minutes ago. We're going to take at least another 10 or 15 minutes here. Okay. In addition to studying nonviolent conflict, we have our own practice of assisting those indirectly who want to use nonviolent conflict. And that consists of distributing the knowledge. And ICNC changed its operational philosophy about 3 years ago, a major shift. We had supported a number of field workshops done by a variety of different groups and organizations who were into training, as we had never really been ourselves, all over the world. Not a huge number, but a fair number of workshops in a lot of different countries. Every conceivable kind of struggle that you can think, social movements, self-determination, all the ones that the breakout sessions were about today, with the, except in, not really movements against exploitation, because we weren't asked to do any of those, and at the time one of our guidelines was we will never go anywhere to do a workshop, we have to be requested to do one in conjunction with a group. But when we were doing that, we were impressed with the fact that we were spending an extraordinary amount of money training way too few people in relation to the vast demand for the practical knowledge of civil resistance. So we decided it really wasn't a good way to proceed if we were disseminating knowledge. What we really needed to do was to make the operating assumption, sort of a useful negative assumption, that we wouldn't be in existence in 5 or 6 or 7 years. And if we weren't going to be in existence in 5, 6, or 7 years, what did we have to do before then to make the knowledge self-distributing? Well, we had to create networks, or at least stimulate the creation of ultimately completely independent, self-standing networks, totally not just autonomous, but completely responsible only to themselves, of action takers, of journalists, of scholars and others who would keep building the knowledge and keep distributing the knowledge, because ultimately it's only going to last as long as stakeholders in both the knowledge and in the doing of civil resistance want it to last. It's not going to last just because there's this organization thinking that it's important, because we're not advocates, we're teachers. So, and that's the strategy we've been, as an organization, we've been trying to implement. So that's so not only develop the knowledge extend the knowledge, and begin to teach it sort of in conventional ways, like at an institute such as this, but also to begin to use digital media and digital dissemination to do that networking and to create new forms of in which to send the content out. So I'd like to ask Darren if he would give you a little bit of an insight into the kinds of things we're doing now, in case they're interesting to you and can inspire you to collaborate with us.
Thanks. But so I actually was thinking about what Jack was saying, and I want to use Gada's drawing here of the vase and the flowers because I think it actually captures this shift that Jack was talking about. So I guess 3 years ago, or prior to my joining ICNC, the way I interpret what you're saying is that ICNC was this kind of vase, and we gathered, developed a lot of information, and then we would, as a vase, move to different parts of the country or parts of the world and do these trainings, and maybe some people would get things out of it, maybe they wouldn't. We had no real way of figuring out whether or not what was being shared and developed in those workshops was being further distributed by the people who were there. And so we figured, let's take a different approach. And so going back to Gada's drawing here, what I see now is that ICNC as an organization, as an educational foundation, we develop, we gather content about, knowledge and content about civil resistance and nonviolent struggle. And then we get people like you, journalists, policymakers, activists, organizers, educators, who help us continually develop this vase. And every now and then you dip in, you take what you want, you mix it up, and you use it for your own purposes. Whether you're an activist with your particular group in your particular context, or an educator, teaching this course in a particular field, whether it's sociology or political science or what have you, you're going to want to take different things from what we develop as an organization and use it for your own purposes. So that's what we're trying to do, is for people to help us develop this vase, and then when it's necessary, dip in there, take what you want, and use it for your own purposes. I think that's the power of particularly digital media in this age, is that now we have the ability to do that. We can take all this information and make it accessible to you. So in a little bit of an easier and more affordable format. So I just want to show you a couple things on our website and dive into it real quick. So the first thing is, we have the honor and privilege of meeting amazing people who are doing amazing things on the ground. People actually doing organizing, directly involved in nonviolent struggle. And we've started a series called On the Ground Interviews with Organizers and Activists. Some of you have actually been interviewed just this week. We want to take this privilege that we have and be able to take your stories and elevate them a little bit so more people are aware of what's happening in your country and in your movements. We also want to tap into your lived experience and knowledge so you can share your own strategies and tactics with other activists. So we've developed a few over the last couple of years. We've got activists from Egypt. We've got a nonviolent direct action trainer in the United States, Stellan Vindhagen, who's from Sweden. Ayad Morar, who's featured in that movie Budrus, which was talked about by Nicole. Activists working on the Thai-Burma border, Russian activists. Herman is from West Papua. So anytime we come across you again and the time is available, we're probably going to sit down with you and do an interview. And we take them and we turn them into about less than 10 minutes and just nuggets of experience from activists. So that's one thing that you can dip into our vase. If there are struggles and activists that are relevant to your own struggle, take them and share them with your colleagues. The other thing is that we have developed, with help of Mache and Jake, we have a webinar series. So we can take a lot of the knowledge sharing that takes place here over these 6 days, but we can extend that throughout the entire year, and we do that online through webinars. And so we have people submit to us different proposals, both academics and activists, that talk about strategic, tactical elements of nonviolent struggle. And all of those are recorded and then made available to everybody online afterwards. So you can watch them live, you can ask questions in real time, but if you're not able to log in and do it, you can watch them later. And I would say on average you get about 75 to 100 people who log into these webinars every other week or so. So if any of you this week are thinking, there's something that's missing from this experience of teaching about nonviolent struggle, whether it's a particular campaign that you were a part of or a historical moment, something that's missing, submit a proposal to webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org, and then we can give you the stage on this online platform to reach people all around the world.
And actually right now we are working on the list of speakers for fall. We'll be developing that in August. So if you have any proposals, and you can send us an email perhaps in July with the kind of outline, perhaps you would like to present or you recommend someone, then we can kind of take that into consideration in August. To start, the webinars will start sometime in September.
And I also want to show you this other website, which was actually built and developed by an FSI participant from last year, also an alumni of the School of Authentic Journalism, Edwin Reed Sanchez. And from his experience at FSI, he felt there's a lot of great citizen journalism out there, people who are capturing key moments in nonviolent movements, but they're kind of scattered all over the internet. So he's saying, well, could ICNC potentially do something that kind of crowdsources all these videos that actually show strategic actions, interviews with activists, so a lot of our on-the-ground interviews are up here, presentations that happen at events like FSI, and put them together in one website and make it easy for people to share those videos, distribute to their colleagues, and basically, organize them in a way that's easy for people to navigate this landscape. And so this is actually just a beta version. And so Edwin wanted me to ask any of you who are interested in being beta testers to actually go through, poke around this website, tell us what's working, what's not working, finding any bugs, how we can make it a little better. Please come and see me, because he has an actual process for being a beta tester for this site. But we're excited about this. And the featured video that's there now, Peter alluded to it yesterday. It's our Civil Resistance, a first look. Can I show this real quick? A first look, and essentially what it attempts to do is take what we have discussed and has been taught in the last 6 days and condense it down into 12 minutes. So it's a great video, and you should definitely check it out.
So we only told you that at the end.
Right, exactly. You guys didn't actually have to come, right?
Can you talk about a class that remind that they should perhaps give us the PowerPoint?
Yeah. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I'll let you talk about the e-classroom if you want, and then you can talk about the video. I just want to plug, where's Nathan? I want to plug the blog Waging Nonviolence. We love the work that they do. We feel that they are capturing stories and providing a deep level of analysis that many other blogs and definitely many other news organizations are not providing. I think Nathan's short 2-minute presentation looking at the metaframes that Dr. Cynthia Boas referenced, that's a testament to the type of work that they do in terms of looking at all these struggles around the world. So we're big supporters of them, and I know he sent out a tweet asking other people to contribute. That this is another way that we share the knowledge about civil resistance is through blogs like Waging Nonviolence. So if you're interested in blogging and writing, please talk to Nathan before you leave.
How many of you had a chance to visit the e-classroom that we have by now? Wow, I'm impressed. So first of all, I would like to ask groups to send me your excellent PowerPoint presentations. We would like to upload them into the e-classes under each of the sessions. If you have them here copied, so I can probably get them from the computer, but if not, please send that to us by email. And e-classroom, as I said, will remain accessible for you. So if you think about actually creating a course, please feel free to use the resources available there on e-class. I would like to also encourage you to consider creating a e-class for the academia that you are working for the center using civilresistancestudies.org, using the e-class, our platform. Actually, we can help you to create the kind of skeleton of the course, could help move the kind of reading resources that you would like to see being in specific sessions, and your students can use our e-class if you would like to. If, for example, you don't have Blackboard or Moodle available in your school, you can use our Moodle, and I would like to encourage you. And if you If you would like to use the e-class, then just let us know. Contact us, and together with Jake, we would help you set this up and run your class on that platform. Okay? Good.
Hardy.
Yeah, I don't even need the mic. I just want to, first of all, say thank you to everyone, because this was awesome. This was amazing. I also want to say stay in touch, okay? This field, one of the great things and also tricky things about it is that there are a lot of people writing about it from a lot of different directions. There's no really one centralized place where it emerged, and not necessarily a centralized place where it's going. But there are people here, particularly us at ICNC, who happen to have read most of the books and a lot of articles. So if you're thinking, gosh, I really need a resource about this, write us and ask. We might know of something. If you're thinking, I want to talk to an expert about that, we may also be able to connect you. Finally, if we can't connect you, or if there's a great idea you have that you're interested in that we don't know anything that's been written about, we may use it as a research idea and find a way to research it. So stay in touch, including by the way, translations. If you are interested in translated materials, we know of quite a few out there. So one of the great things about working at ICNC is that we have an educational mission. We like to educate people. We like to share knowledge. So really, don't be shy about sending any of us an email.
Great. I think Nicola has a few words to share with us. She, by the way, in addition to being someone who knows more than I will ever know about social media, way more than I'll ever know about social media, has, as a matter of her own interest, invented a whole new website for those interested in defending human rights, which obviously relates really closely to our work. So she's done it from the inside out, and doesn't simply, like me, have some sort of loose notional idea of what social media accomplishes.
Can I just come here?
You can.
For ICNC, just one word about ICNC. All the resources that you just saw, I'm working on an app for ICNC. 2 years ago, when I came to ICNC and I met Ivan, I said to him, I'd love to be able to say, do you have a dictator or corruption problem in your country? There's an app for that. So that slogan now is coined by Apple, so I'm not allowed to use it anymore. But I'm working on an app, and I'll probably be looking for beta testers for that too, and ideas and stuff. So that's for the social media. I mean, all of you that have seen the Facebook page, all of you have seen the group. It's great how active everybody is, and really the key is integration and cross-posting and to spread the word. About my initiative, thank you, Jack, for mentioning that. So the website that I'm currently building is called Human Rights Connected, and it came from the idea, and I would have talked about it in the session that I didn't talk at, as you probably noticed, where the importance, which I've actually said, the real strategic value and importance of activists on the ground, political activists, to be more knowledgeable, but technical knowledge on human rights. So we're not talking broad concepts. We're not talking about the vague ideas, but getting into the complicated stuff that usually is not accessible, maybe pedagogically or even just accessible, as in where do I find that on that website? Because even the UN website, when you look at it, I don't know if you've ever looked for a convention on that website, it's impossible. Google is also not really helpful because their algorithms and personalization algorithms are a mystery to pretty much everybody, probably also to the people at Google. So they're not helping either. So Human Rights Connected is going to be a crowdsourced platform for everybody to contribute the best links, pedagogically speaking, but also with usefulness on campaigns, actions, tools, resources on human rights law, international human rights instruments. And I hope to be launching soon, knock on wood, in a month or two, and I'll definitely need beta testers for that as well, but also more importantly, input from people who teach human rights themselves, so that Human Rights Connected can become a spot where activists, instead of having to turn to obscure websites or organizations that can teach themselves and get access to these resources themselves and use this in their campaign and contextualize their struggles in a human rights language so that, you know, the whole world of human rights becomes more accessible. So I'll definitely give you guys a shout out.
So back to questions, conclusions, final thoughts. This is your chance, since tonight is merely celebration. Joe.
Question. Jack, I recently wrote about your ideas on emergent properties, and I was planning to ask you on that, but actually I think it's something you might talk to, you know, to everybody about.
I'm sorry, my ideas about what?
Emergent properties.
Oh, emergent properties.
Civil resistance. And I think Maciej's touched upon that as well while he was speaking. From many of the movements that I've looked at, there have been deep and prolonged civil resistances, and maybe they've worked for 20, 30 years, and then you would find another wave. Is speaking about, you know, we've been having conversations late night over permanent revolutions and other speculative thoughts. What is, you know, taking on what Thomas Jefferson had said about revolution, that every generation must, you know, reinvigorate its own revolutionary ideal, or what is this? Are emergent properties something that have to be renewed and or is it something that you have a civil resistance and you've reached the ideal for based on the properties that you've mentioned? How do you see them? Is it generational? Is it final? Is it teleological? Is it?
Well, I think that they are, and since this was part of the presentation I gave on Monday, I don't need to go over that ground or present to you again what it was, because you can refer back to it in a few weeks through the video of that presentation and other versions of it that are already on our website. But I think what the work of a movement or a campaign imparts to a society, which is, I use the term emergent properties to represent representation, resilience, the idea of consent, reason as a way of not merely communicating but also infusing and supporting the debate and the discussion and the exchange of ideas on which all free political action rests, are come forth conspicuously when popular movements and campaigns succeed or are perceived to have succeeded historically. And for a generation, typically, in one form or another, there are thought leaders in the society who vividly remember that, because the events serve as a way to stimulate your memory of what they represent. And so as they remember those ideas and want to continue to practice them, if that society has recurring events which require those who think about events to go back to their explanations of what is happening, then you can have your refreshment or your continual reemergence of those properties that way. Big challenges economically, not so much because necessarily of internal revolutions, but also because of external challenges, such as wars and invasions. Societies and nations can also re-experience what those, by property I mean not simply a value, but a lived sensation politically and socially of what it means to construct, fight for, and continue to retain your own rights and freedoms. And so I think those do naturally reemerge simply because almost all societies are going to have very difficult and challenging circumstances for reasons they don't have any control over, or because of what some societies experience, which is the loss of if I could use this phrase, democratic muscle tissue. The democracies devolve. They don't dissolve, but they become disused even if there is still the armature of elections and candidates running for office and throwing brickbats of language at one another. So I don't necessarily agree with Jefferson. He did, after all, speak 200 years ago, and I'm not sure that insurrectionary activity is necessary in order to re-enliven all of that. Nonviolent movements certainly do. I mean, the guy that was sitting here for half the week, Jim Lawson, was responsible in no small part for that re-enlivening of democratic values which the civil rights movement in the United States represented. I mean, what you're going through in Egypt, is a vast national, not just an experiment in trying to set up a democracy which will function reasonably well, but certainly not in institutionalizing those properties. They have to be present in the hearts and minds and in the lived experiences and the professional choices and in the activity, the civic activity of the whole society going forward. That spirit has to continue to be lived and represented. That has to be a matter of individuals choosing to do that. But I hope that doesn't sound too terribly ambiguous as an answer to your question. But I think that we are talking about phenomena that an academic might call political psychological, more than we're talking about something that can be kept alive through organized institutional activity. I don't think organized institutional activity is the likely carrier of this. States certainly aren't. Governments. Civic activity is much more so, but it's not civic. By the way, how many people here have heard of the Robert Putnam's book Bowling Alone? The title for Bowling Alone actually came from Peter Ackerman, because in his years in business, at one point, he had bought a small company or invested heavily in a small company which owned lots of bowling alleys, and so he had to learn something about the bowling industry. And he found out that in some study of the bowling industry that it was long-term declining, slowly declining, because bowling leagues, there weren't nowhere near as many bowling leagues in the United States. People were bowling alone. There were no more bowling leagues. And so he knew that, and he was at lunch here over in Cambridge with Robert Putnam one day, and Putnam was talking about his new book. He said, "Oh, that's Bowling Alone," which became the title of Putnam's book. But that happens in lots of societies, and so much of this rests on mechanisms for solidarity, which can be purely small s social, or they can be social in the sense of what keeps the social tissue in a society together. All politics rests on participation, and every movement and campaign doesn't function without participation. Almost everything that we've been talking about this week relates to participation, and it's voluntary. You can't coerce it, and so that's what societies lose. And societies, as we know, in the last 100 years, have lost their democratic political mechanisms because participation has flagged and people have outsourced. They assume that a charismatic leader or a political party or an ideology can do the work of participation for them. Doesn't work. So they're going to get an experience that requires the society to relearn participation in some sort of organized fashion. And I think that's what I was driving at with that. That's not what I expect to write about in the next several years, except tangentially. Maybe you should write about it, Joe. That's what we want to do. We want to get other people to do the writing and other people to do the videos and other people to take responsibility for this field. Other comments, other concluding thoughts, or I'm sorry, Nicole.
Where's the bar?
This is just really quick. I saw Victoria's post in response to the question about research on nonviolent movements that haven't worked. And I am actually not someone who can say whether this exists well or not, except for that my experience in political science and social movements was that was never the main question that the big rigorous thinkers were asking. So if they looked at movements, it wasn't evaluating what worked or what didn't. But somebody at Victoria, I think, posted the Strategic Logic of Suicide Bombing by Robert Pape as something that speaks to that. And I actually wanted to use it as an example of a piece that's not answering that question per se. So he's talking about an assumption by organizations or individuals that it's not working and moving on, but it's not a study of what worked or not. And I think that Jack was right on, that there's very little out there. Although maybe that's something that over time the center can bring together, is all of the pieces that are pro or against. I guess, Rankin, you could probably speak to this more than any of us. You've looked at all of this.
She's talking about, as I just finished a study that tears down all the literature on a struggle against untouchability in India and Kerala in the 1920s. And everything that was published outside of India on it was wrong. Everybody who wrote about it was wrong, including Gene Sharp. And just demolished the literature. And we're going to have to do that with a lot of struggles, Jack. Not only have things not been properly literatured, we'd actually got to go back and destroy what's in the record and recreate it from the bottom up.
Or supplant it with better.
We all need, 2 or 3 other lifetimes.
But just remember that as you go forward and you're drawing on literature, you're seeing that scholars have found that nonviolence didn't work here. Very few of them actually did the study of what was done, what was effective, what wasn't, and why. I don't think a lot of that's out there. So if you hear that argument, I would really look at the source and be aware.
Well done.
I just want to say thanks to ICNC staff. I really can't put into words how helpful and supportive I find all of you. And you're fun to hang out with. You're smart. You're outgoing. You're open. The whole, our experience with you guys, and most of you actually only knew over email until now. From beginning, however many years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, to this point, considering that you're from also diverse backgrounds, you're rock stars.
Thank you very much. And thank you. By the way, we've all been commenting behind the scenes in the last couple of days. This is the best FSI, this is the best group we've ever had. And it's true.